Welcome to Fight News Now. It's John Pollock, John Ramdeen, and Robin Black coming at you. And with all of the news this past week, some things fell through the cracks, including the fact that Dan Henderson is now poised to get the next middleweight title shot against Michael Bisping. We had discussed this coming off the Hector Lombard win and Bisping winning the title at 199. Do you like this fight, John?
I do like this fight. I like this fight as long as George St-Pierre is not in the picture. And according to Dana White, he will never step foot in the octagon again. And again, we know the game. BJ Penn retired a bunch of times. Randy Couture retired a bunch of times, but didn't actually retire. So
in fact, George has said the complete opposite of what Dana is saying, and that would lend me to think that this is a negotiating tactic and that these two are at loggerheads.
And that's what it comes down to. It comes down to if the George St-Pierre, Michael Bisping fight is not made, this is a perfect consolation for the fans. There's history, there's meaning, there's something for the hardcore fans, although we all love Michael Bisping.
Even given where Henderson is ranked in comparison to the other guys.
Forget about the rankings. There's a story there, and this is an interesting fight for Michael Bisping, and it's an interesting fight for Dan Henderson, and the hardcore fans would love nothing more than Dan Henderson to win a UFC championship. And I think this is one of those fights where you could see there's a real possibility. And I know a fight is a fight, and Dan Henderson is where he is at this point, but you could clearly see how Dan Henderson can once again beat Michael Bisping.
Hey, I think I'm a hardcore fan, and I want to see Mike avenge the loss to Dan Henderson. Now, I'm also a Michael Bisping mark. Hey, remember when everybody said Michael Bisping sucks, he can't crack an egg? Everyone used to hate him.
We didn't say that.
No, we didn't. Canadians always liked Michael Bisping, but I want to see Michael Bisping avenge that loss. And those two things in juxtaposition is why this is an interesting fight. Listen, it's not just John Ramdeen who doesn't believe in the rankings. They're kind of nonsense. You know what I mean? A bunch of journalists sit around. I mean, Damian Maia was number 7 a couple of weeks ago. Now he's number 3. Didn't fight in the in-between. Some guys' opinions of him just changed.
Okay, but you know, you guys have very knowledgeable opinions. And if we are to throw out middleweights, Luke Rockhold, Chris Weidman, Yoel Romero, Jacare, and Dan Henderson. Is Dan Henderson above number 5 for either of you of those 5 contenders?
If you're looking at when it comes to physical abilities and what they've done and where they are in the sport, absolutely not. I think we all recognize that Yoel Romero and Jacare may be physically in their prime. They may be ahead of Dan Henderson, but it comes down to also their ability to sell fights and to make big fights. And I think because
there is a story here.
There is a story there, and that's what it comes down to. The UFC is looking at what will do the biggest business, and a rematch with Dan Henderson, I think, will do that over a fight with Yoel Romero and a fight with Jacare.
Are we at the point yet where we can say what will do the biggest business? That's the corporate approach. The audience approach can be what does the audience like the most? What will excite the audience? What
but you're kind of one and the same, Robin.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And if we agree that that is how fights are made, then we don't have to have this argument anymore. Oh, does this make sense in the rankings? Jacare didn't think it made sense. Do you think Jacare would think that makes sense? Of course not. He wants the money. He wants to fight for the title too. But you got Dan Henderson in his mid-40s, basically saying, I would be on my way out. He'd look to win and probably retire the champion. How cool would that be? Or Bisping, all you got to see is Dan flying through the air to punch Mike out. Michael Bisping comes and beats Anderson Silva, wins the middleweight title, and then avenges the worst loss ever. If you're a Michael Bisping guy, you got that. In England. So do we care where Jacare, Luke Rockhold, Chris Weidman? Kind of we do, but do we understand that this is not how fights get made anymore? I think we understand that now, right?
It is a big hook to a fight, not just the rematch, but the fact that this very likely could be Dan Henderson's last fight, win or lose, and that's an interesting story. Now, I throw out those middleweight contenders, and we know Bisping and Dan Henderson. Let's say that's going to happen in the fall. There's even the possibility, if George St-Pierre does want to come back, could he get the winner of that fight? If you're one of those middleweight contenders and you're looking at least for the rest of this year, the title is tied up, and maybe even into next year, of those 4 guys I listed earlier, are you looking up at 205 pounds and stating, hey, if I'm Yoel Romero, I am a huge middleweight, that division is in dire need of contenders, and if I'm looking at a year away before I might get a title fight in this bottleneck division, are you looking upwards at 205?
I think, and this is something that I've been a fan of for years and years, I think they're the athletes that can go back and forth in different weights and make an impact I think they benefit the most. And yes, Yoel Romero, this would be a perfect opportunity. They're running out of challenges at 205 pounds.
You could argue right away, Yoel Romero or Chris Weidman fighting Daniel Cormier, immediate title fight.
Right.
That division doesn't have a ton of
Just
contenders.
don't take any supplements that might be tainted, and then you won't have to worry about all these fluctuating weights.
But also for George, it's like, yes, I want this fight with Michael Bisping because A, the 185-pound title is on the line. Only a handful of guys have ever been 2 division champions. On top of that, it's a huge payday. Michael Bisping knows how to sell a fight. So if you're not getting the fight at 185 pounds, he also mentioned going down to 155 pounds, and I would expect the fight that he would want is Conor McGregor. If Conor McGregor happens to be the 155-pound champion.
What about George St-Pierre and Eddie Alvarez?
Sure, Eddie Alvarez, George St-Pierre would be interesting as well, but when you're talking about the money of things, the business of things, I think those are the 2 most attractive fights for GSP.
I just want to address what you guys said earlier about Dana saying he's, he knows the mentality of a guy who wants to fight or doesn't want to fight, and this guy doesn't want to fight, and the guy's also saying he does want to fight. We have to, when we see interviews with fighters, coaches, Dana, anybody, we have to ask one question. Are they telling the truth or are they lying? We have to ask that about John Jones. Oh my God, I took a tainted supplement. Is he telling the truth or is he lying? If we ask that about everything, all of a sudden, all this coverage of this guy said this and this guy said that changes. Right now, a lot of media just reports what somebody says as if it's a fact. It's just something they said. There are a million reasons that fighters lie, coaches lie, Dana lies, millions of reasons. Dana could be telling the truth that he truly looks at this guy and goes, I'd love it if this guy fought, but I know guys who don't want to fight, and what they usually do is argue about little details that don't lead to it. Guys who want to fight are like, I don't care about the difference of 20,000 here and a sponsorship thing there. Let's just make this fight. He could believe that.
Is that a mistake, though? Is that when you look at the sport of mixed martial arts, we've seen that there are a lot of athletes that have been in this game because they want to fight in the UFC, and they leave the sport penniless, and they leave the sport broken, and they go back to shattered families. Isn't it about time that these athletes... It's true.
Got dark in here.
When you look at that, shouldn't these athletes try to make the most? Shouldn't George St-Pierre go back to the table and say, yeah, I do want to fight, but this Reebok deal was not in place when I was in the UFC. Now we have to come to some sort of agreement to compensate me. I'm one of the biggest names ever in mixed martial arts.
Of course, it's knowing your value.
Of course, but at the same time, to give some credence to the idea that Dana White is putting forward is just this. If you are the type of guy who's like, no matter what, I want to fight, you can still play the game and argue and discuss those kinds of things. But if you're the guy who's like, well, how much money is it? What are we doing? What about drug testing? All these things, those are things that are put out there that you can feel like you're dipping your toe in the conversation of fighting. You need to go in and fight if you're like behind closed doors, God, I gotta fight. My life is incomplete without fighting. Now, that could be a lie presented to Dana and others because you don't want him to know you're so desperate to fight. You just want him to see, if he doesn't believe that you're desperate to fight, he may have these conversations. But you need to be desperate to do it. You need to be looking at this fight as if your life would be incomplete if you didn't have one more fight. Anything short of that, you should not fight.
But at the same time, yeah, I understand that. The desire to go in there and compete, you're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that on the day of your bout, you're going to be in the best physical shape to perform at the highest level. But when you just saw that the UFC was sold for $4 billion, you certainly want your chunk of the change, considering where you know your place in the sport. As you pointed out, if you know your value, you know that the UFC needs you, let's come to an agreement.
Yeah, and it goes right back to the stories are not face value and should never be treated at face value. Not that everybody in the world is a liar or anything, but at the same time, when people are playing games of leverage, Dana wants to see from George that he's desperate to fight. George needs to be desperate to fight or he shouldn't do it, but then he needs to hide that from Dana so he can negotiate. That complex layers of humans interacting is what's at play here. If Dana's really looking him in the eyes and going, I've been down this road with guys before. We're sitting here talking about $20,000 Reebok thing with a guy worth $20 million. He doesn't want to fight. George could be like, oh, God, I want to fight so bad, but I don't want him to know it. Those are the layers at play.
Yeah, and I think one final thing on Dana White's comment. I mean, at the end of that, like, you can watch the video. It's his opinion that George is not going going to fight again. Not getting, to me, the same kind of coverage is that earlier in the week, Lorenzo Fertitta did an interview. He disagrees with Dana White. So, I mean, it's just an opinion of Dana.
But you have to remember,
and he's entitled to his opinion.
It's true. But you have to remember that when Dana White talks, the entire mixed martial arts world buys into exactly what he says. Dana White said, we're not selling the UFC. This is our organization. I mean, I guess he is staying with the organization.
Are you saying that promoters may misdirect in conversation?
I'm just saying the masses tend to believe Dana White. They probably, besides you and a handful of the MMA media, very few people probably saw Lorenzo Fertitta saying that George St-Pierre is coming back.
All right, let's finish off on some fight changes. For UFC 201, CR Bahadrzada, he is off of his fight, and taking his place to fight Jorge Masvidal is Ross Pearson, who's going to jump up to 170 and fight on 2.5 weeks' notice after losing to Will Brooks on Friday night. And then UFC 202, conversely, Dong-Yun Kim is out of his fight with Neil Magny. Lorenz Larkin will step in for Kim on the UFC 202 card. First of all, with Ross Pearson, I mean, coming back on short notice and fighting at 170. This is a guy that was fighting at featherweight not all that long ago.
Yeah, I love this. I think this, if you want to make a whole boatload of money in MMA, be available for as many weight classes as humanly possible, as long as it's safe and it's healthy. In that fight with Will Brooks, you know, he lost the fight, but he didn't take a beating in that fight. Will Brooks just had to come in, get his feet wet, get the big victory, and he did exactly that. Awesome for Ross Pearson. I think this is the type of fight that he wants against another stand-up
against Robin's guy.
Yeah, against my guy. Hey, man, you know. Ross Pearson looked phenomenal against Chad Laprise. I thought he lost that split decision in Australia, but he did look very good. And the thing about the Laprise fight, Laprise is a very complicated fighter, fighting on weird angles with weird off-time rhythms and stuff, much like Jorge Masvidal. So he's been there before. But Masvidal is a slick guy.
The UFC has a rare weekend off, but then they're back the following one in Chicago, headlined by Holly Holm and Valentina Shevchenko. We will have a full 1-hour preview show coming your way next Thursday night, July the 21st at 7 p.m. Eastern.